University of Copenhagen and Roskilde University, and ended up switching my thesis to the Danish context. And then after that, I was so sad about leaving the Danish context behind that every chance I got, I conducted research with colleagues over there. And then finally, I ended up conducting this study, not with immigrant children, which had mainly been my focus, but with university students and mainly professors. So that was a big change. So the context, the broader European context, very briefly, there was the Bologna Accord to promote movement among faculty and students with the idea of creating global citizens with transferable skills and obtaining double degrees. But some researchers like Jenkins and Pratt have suggested that languages got a little bit sidelined in the discourse on globalization and internationalization, and that language didn't really come up so much in the discussion. So broadly, in terms of why English medium instruction in Denmark, there was a paper by Kotz, Yurda, and Garrett in 2014 about language policies and practices in the internationalization of higher education on the European margins. And so Denmark would be considered one of the countries that's on the margins. And the way they phrased it was that in the move for attracting the best and the brightest and wanting to move up in the university rankings, universities really want to attract international students, but how many students, they might go to Italy, which is a major language, huge population, in Germany, etc., but they didn't think that Denmark, for example, has 5 million people. How many people would invest in 2 years of intensive language study to then do a master's degree in Denmark? So they thought that English medium instruction was a good way to bring international students to universities where the national language was maybe a less sought after language. Breaks my heart to think of Danish that way, but so in terms of the Danish policy context, in around 2008, there was a Nordic Declaration of Language Policy and Cooperation that started talking about parallel language use. And so, yes, English was coming in, English medium instruction, but there was supposed to be emphasis on Danish as a mother tongue, immigrant languages as mother tongues, English too. And so without talking about plurilingualism, it was really sort of respecting plurilingualism. Other aspects, there were sort of warnings, for example, Skepnam Kangas about English as a killer language and what would that do. And also Philipson had long warned, since his book English Only Europe, about the risk of domain loss if they were to stop having Danish medium higher education. And then there were others who thought it was a good idea, for example, the paper by Kotz. And so this raised the implications of what would that do, because they really, when I had gone to university there in the 1990s, there hadn't really been international professors. They had more been ethnic Danish professors. So this was really going to change the landscape with international professors and many more international students. The university profile is very highly ranked, 73rd in the world, 22nd in Europe, 1st in the Nordic countries. And the majority of the bachelor level courses are in Danish, but in the science programs, for example, where there's 10,000 students, already at the bachelor level they did have some English medium instruction. So for example, ethnology and health sciences was taught in English. So the majority of the students would be coming out of Danish gymnasium and going right into English studies. So coming to the research again, I had also been involved with a Shirk proposal with Steve Marshall and Danielle Moore, and they had their ongoing work looking at generic academic literacy course at UBC, and some of the results from that course, and students trying to use their first languages and having plurilingualism, and reporting that the instructors found it was a dilemma, and that they found the students who were English as an international language had insufficient language skills, and they expressed discomfort with students speaking multiple languages, and they did not recognize plurilingualism as an tacit. So my thought was, what if all the professors were bilingual at least? Would they be more empathetic to the students who were all learning, except for some few English as a first language students that ended up in the program? Basically, all the Danish students, it was at least their second language. The international students, it was at least their second or third language. And would that maybe make a difference? So the rationale was that plurilingual faculty members, L1 might not be Danish. Their proficiency in English and Danish would vary. They might have translingual strategies and empathy for plurilingual students' linguistic needs in disciplinary teaching. And they may or may not recognize the ideological component of having certain expectations for how the students would perform in academic language. And they could possibly see languages, first language as the problem, resource, or right, such as Ruiz has discussed. So the questions were, did they empathize with their students? Did they employ translingual teaching strategies? And what role did critical language awareness play in their identity constructions? And this is with professors who had no interest in applied linguistics, no background in applied linguistics, but I just thought that perhaps since the university had switched from Danish medium in 2008 to English, sort of overnight for the professors, maybe having had students in a biology course in Danish, their first language, they could troubleshoot certain difficult topics, and maybe knowing that was going to be a difficult topic and having had experience with teaching students that it was no longer in Danish, maybe they would have just developed something so that the students would succeed better. And so critical language awareness is the awareness that language conventions and practices are invested with power relations and ideological processes that people are often unaware of. And so you can have many forms of ideologies, but basically what sort of beliefs about languages, for example, in the production and reproduction of the social order and the moral order, and did they see English as an international language as good for the world or risky for language ecologies or somewhere in between? What was their view on minority languages and a local language sort of being cast in the same situation as a minority language? So Danish, what was their view on Danish, for example? And so I thought possibly their monolingual instructional ideologies might come through. Their view that it should be English only, no translation, languages should be kept separate. And it might also depend on the Danish proficiency of the international professors. The ethnic Danish professors were certainly proficient in Danish, and they could go back and forth between English and Danish, but if they had the ideology that that was not ideal, or if a biology professor just doesn't see their role as doing that. So I was very curious how that would play out and how that would play out in their pedagogy. And so there was this sort of tacit plurilingualism in that Nordic document. So this idea of a social actor, varying degrees of proficiency in different languages, not fixed competencies, and that they could change over the course of lives. So for example, if an international professor was hired and was learning Danish, but then they didn't get tenure and they moved on to a different national context, maybe they had been very invested in Danish, but they weren't living in Denmark anymore and they didn't get the position, they could be less invested in Danish. So again, looking at the different social paths of the professors and where they all sort of were individually in terms of that. But also just basically looking at the setting was very plurilingual. And so what sort of translanguaging was going on, if there was any? Was education reframed as a space for plural language practices? Whereas the Marshall and Moore paper had suggested that wasn't happening naturally. I thought maybe it would be happening more naturally in this space. And so when you hear about plural or translingual pedagogy, it often relates more to the K-12 literature. So for example, multi-language texts, language portfolios, linguistic history interviews, plurilinguaging in readers theater, but that wouldn't necessarily work well in a geology course or these sorts of things. So I was wondering how the professors had interpreted the needs of the students, and did they have some form of translingual pedagogy happening. There is the precedent of Kanagaraja's work. He had taught a second language writing course and introduced code meshing. And so in the middle of writing a composition, a person who spoke Arabic had included some Arabic. She was trying to describe her experience learning English as a second language, and she purposely put some Arabic into the text, knowing the readers wouldn't be able to understand it, and wanted them to sort of experience what it's like not to understand something the way she had. So she was doing it for effect. Less obvious how you would put that into geology. And so my methodology, I had a little bit of a surprise because I had expected to stay. They had a researcher hotel, and I had stayed there before, and it was extremely reasonable, but it had closed just before, a month or so before I went to do my data collection, and I ended up having to stay in a hotel, so that very much cut down my data collection period. So I didn't have student observations, so I had professor interviews and document analysis, and several of the interviews I was able to do while I was there, but I also did some via Skype, etc. when I got back to Canada. The professors were from social sciences, math, sciences, arts and humanities, health and medical sciences, and I also analyzed quite a few documents, Nordic, Danish national, and university policy documents. So briefly in terms of the findings, do plurilingual professors teaching disciplinary content through the medium of English empathize more with their students or employ translingual teaching strategies? And basically, was it sort of similar to this common ground question that I wondered if they would say to me, well, you know, it's my second language too, and I'm really understanding that, you know, they're writing, their papers are in another language and the lectures, and so I'm doing these things to make the lectures more comprehensible. And basically, they weren't insulted, but they just didn't see any common ground. Because especially the international professors, a lot of them had done their doctorates in an English-speaking country, no matter where they were from. If they were from Brazil or wherever, they had maybe done their doctorate somewhere in Canada, the United States, and they wrote all their academic papers in English. And so compared to the students, they found their level was so much more advanced that they weren't seeing the connection. And I found that this really contradicted some previous findings. So for example, Henriksen and Holman and Kling have just published a book, and in it they were talking about specifically ethnic Danish professors feeling like they lacked sufficient English skills compared to the students. They found the students had stronger English, and they felt a loss of authority when teaching in English due to their lack of linguistic competence. And even with my few ethnic Danish professors that I interviewed, that didn't come across at all, and I'll mention that in the discussion. So both the Danish and the international professors showed insight into language hierarchies, but they really looked at it as a fait accompli in terms of the hegemony of English. And they saw English really as a pragmatic necessity. And so Danish was very present in the institution, but they didn't see the need for it to be present in their courses or in their teaching. In the institution, once you were into departmental meetings, and if you wanted to advance, for example, to become a chair or whatever, professors knew that they had to speak Danish. But in terms of the courses, they just really thought that English was what the students needed. Empathy varied a bit per discipline, and some of them said, well, it was a very competitive recruitment process, and they had in-person meetings with incoming master's students, and they wanted to really be sure that their English proficiency was strong enough to be able to navigate the system in English. Oops, I think I didn't. Sorry. That was that slide. Okay. Okay. All right. So one professor said, for example, there are no huge Danish journals for scientists. So if a supervisor wants their students to have a paper published, it has to be in English. And I don't know how, as native Danish speakers, how they go about hoping the Danish students write English papers. So they thought they were doing the best thing for the students, because especially if they were going to go on and do a doctorate and publish, and students need to publish, that Tier 1 journals would be in English, not in Danish, and to develop the English skills that they needed to have this experience already at the master's level. However, and one of the ethnic Danish professors made the comment that, and he was working in the sciences, that he didn't think he could publish in Danish anymore, that he had been publishing in English for so long, and that his academic language was English, and that he would be really, really hard pressed if there was a level of Danish journal that he wanted to publish in. He thought he would have a really hard time writing a paper in academic Danish. And so I think that may speak a little bit to the fears of domain loss, if that would be so difficult for him. But it also raises the issue of what about knowledge mobilization and getting out reports and briefs to the Danish public, because they would have to be written in Danish, and presumably he would be quite able to write that. But other people, how would they write briefs unless they just gave it to someone to translate? So the findings broadly support the literature, but then there are some changes afoot. So, in terms of the interview data that I had, languages were, plurilingualism was sidelined in the discourse on globalization, and language really wasn't a category of analysis in this push for globalization. And there was a need to make a space for other languages. But these issues were partially addressed. There was a new iteration of the Nordic policy that just came out in 2018, and it really makes a strong case for plurilingualism. So going back to that discrepancy that I mentioned between some of the people were saying that, you know, their level was so much beyond the students, there was no common ground between them and the students, and the other source that reported that the professors felt they had lost authority because their English was weaker than the students. And I think it came down to where the ethnic Danish professors, what pool they were coming from. I wasn't actually looking to speak to the international professors. My goal was to speak to the ethnic Danish professors to see what, if they had experienced the courses in Danish before, what they did when they were taught in English. And I had very few of them, and it had to do with my letter had gone out to the chairs of departments, and I think they thought I was more interested in the international professors. So the professors that were in the other study, there is like an ESP center, and after the English medium instruction was introduced, they had been having one-on-one courses in that ESP center with professors to build up their vocabulary in their specific domains, and I believe those interviews came from speaking to them, and I didn't actually have access to them. So I was speaking to these mainly international students who, like I said, they had studied abroad, and they also said in their interviews that a lot of the reason for them being hired was because of their level of English. So I think the different results had to do with the different pools of participants. So sort of as a final word, this new take on parallel language policy has come out in a document published by the Nordic Council of Ministers in 2018. And they have really shifted the focus of English medium instruction. So now there's some onus on the students. If the whole study program is in English or another international language, it should be possible for elements of the program to be taught in the local language, Danish, in order to familiarize international students with the surrounding language community. That could be challenging for the students to have strong enough Danish to understand it. And again, there's the whole Cox issue about would they invest, would they come, would they take 1 or 2 years of language courses so that they could understand? So how exactly would that happen? There's a focus on teaching in the international classroom and that there should be awareness. They should take on board all of the students' combined language resources. And there's also some onus on the professors. The international classroom is about ensuring that teaching takes into account the total language competencies of a given group of students, so plurilingualism. There are other aspects of it, sort of carrot and stick. There were some stick aspects, so there were contractual obligations. They would issue warnings to the international professors if they weren't getting their Danish up to snuff. The amount of time that they would have to learn the language was getting written into the contract. There would be routine meetings between managers and employees, so the employees being professors, to discuss the employee's career, taking into account the development of the individual's language skills. So basically tenure would be on the line. And so this really puts, Cott's paper into new perspective, but then politically, the right-wing government was less supportive of English medium instruction and worried about domain loss and interested in having more Danish medium instruction again. So it's really something that's becoming, and it's interesting when you conduct interviews and a new policy document comes out, that sort of thing. So I'm very happy to take questions and explain anything that wasn't very clear, or thank you very much.
Yes, we already have one question.
Can I just ask a point of clarification about the thing right at the very end there? This change in the policy towards more strictness with learning Danish if you're an international professor, and the use of Danish in the classrooms. Do you think that that is a purely political move because there was a right-wing government, because an element of a nationalistic element, or do you think that it is a recognition that they need to take steps to protect the language abilities in their own language, to avoid the domain loss? So, I mean, do you see, is this a political thing, or is this a professional decision, do you think?
I think I understand from one of the authors that there was pressure from the government, but I think too they recognize that it never was the idea that it was going to be English only. The parallel language policy, it was always the hope that it wouldn't be losing the domains. So, but there's some aspects to it that are really complicated. So. There were other things that I didn't read. So for example, lecturers should learn about how to teach in a language other than the first one, and how to teach students with the first language other than the teaching one. And when you look at the different faculties that they came from, that's really adding on a pedagogical applied linguistics focus. And then they also said full parallel language use is achieved when international employees are able to write research texts and outreach texts in the local language. So that would be about a C2. So that's a good chunk of investment in learning the language. In the interviews, the professors had discussed that when they had been hired, they had said, do I need to speak Danish? And they had been told, no, you don't need it. And they could feel things changing while they were there, and they were seeing some colleagues not get tenure and that sort of thing. So it was a very interesting experience because I was sort of relating to all the different interviews, but some of the things that they would say were, it's a small language, and I I really don't need it academically. And, you know, if they weren't, seemed to make a difference if they didn't have children or they weren't sort of connected to the school system and the broader society. Then they really were just kind of living in their academic world, and they were okay with English because all their colleagues spoke English. Other ones who were sort of getting out into broader society, they were wanting to learn Danish. So with me trying to maintain Danish for all these years, I thought, yeah, but you're living here, I think you should learn Danish. But then, you know, you think of expat people working in Hong Kong forever, do they learn Chinese and that sort of thing? So, yeah, so I think it's a mix. Like, I'm sure the authors, they're really going back to the initial idea of parallel language policy and how that got lost in the whole globalization focus, and it all just switched to English. I don't know how, I would have to speak to people to get the backstory to how it all came across. And I don't think these things have teeth, or maybe they do, maybe they won't get tenure, and maybe the things that are the contractual obligations are really going to be enforced.
Sounds a bit strange though that if they are aiming at getting tenure, they are not ready. Tenure means living there theoretically forever, or at least for a long time, and they are not ready, even if they don't have children, you know, to learn the language, because already there is a problem with academic living in their own world, even when there is only one language. Imagine if that word is completely a bubble in comparison to the society. Okay, Danish people, I think, lots of them function in English as well, can function in English, but not necessarily everybody. So I kind of see them very different from the expats that go to Hong Kong and know that they stay there, I don't know, 3 years and then they go back. And for 3 years they don't want to make that investment in Chinese. But if you move to a Chinese speaking country forever, I mean, personally, I don't see how you don't invest in that language. To me, it sounds very strange, but maybe other people think differently.
So, Professor Taylor, thank you very much for that. That was really, for me, that was very insightful. I'm very curious, though, about the third or fourth slide that you had there, that you showed your research questions involving the influences that affect identity constructions. So, to me, when I look at that, I think it's connected to the question of the professors sympathizing with their students. What have you found so far from this that influences more their identity, their empathy, sympathy with the students in their classroom, or the pragmatic reasons for just being there, doing their job, and just existing in the university? Which one shifts their identity and this sort of sense of investment around that the most, do you think?
I'd say I'm not that far into it yet.
Okay.
And the interviews are quite different. You know, you have some of them that they basically, that wasn't the way the job was sold to them and they weren't interested. And then you have other ones who it was their second month on the job and they were taking Danish courses and really interested in learning it. There was another professor who had set up a writing course for science, so sort of discoursive science, and was recognizing that the students needed, you know, academic writing specifically in that genre, and then other ones where, you know, language isn't my job, and so there's really the gamut. In terms of identity, yeah, I'm not deep enough into it yet.
I'd be curious about that. Thank you.
Other than that, there were many different ideologies at play.
But they're coming in with those ideologies already, so they may shift things as the needs of the job demand, or as their own sense of working along and getting along with students increases, perhaps.
Shelley, I was wondering about Well, a number of different things, but one of them that follows up on this sort of line of conversation is with regards to the experiences that some of the Danes or other international scholars may have had learning English the hard way, and perhaps bringing that experience to bear. So I had to do it. Like, this is just the way it's going to be. I toughed it out. I could be successful. Now it's your turn. This is the way the world is. Did you see much of that?
They weren't really relating to that question. That was sort of my key question, and I was getting more information on kind of difficulties of the job related to Danish. For example, everything would be English, there would be a faculty meeting, the language would switch to Danish, and all the international faculty would leave. And in the new document, it's saying, well, that's creating extra work, so they have to learn Danish. But there was sort of resistance from several of the interviews. And again, it was this distinction between that wasn't what we were told. And it was more along the line of COTS, that you're so strong in English and you'll really be able to help us. You'll be able to teach these courses in English. You'll bring so much to the department because, you know, we want your expertise in English. And so there was a little pushback.
And then I guess my second question was really related to the university supports. When I think of most of our universities in Canada, we have centers for teaching and learning that provide all kinds of supports for the professors.
Well,
Did they have
an amazing one? And that's where that other publication came from. And they were looking at, and so they definitely, ever since the parallel strategy came in and the courses were taught in English, it's really advanced, and it's a huge center, and they have one-on-one courses meeting the needs of the professors, and, you know, working one-on-one to develop that vocabulary, and so that the professors feel comfortable. But that seemed to be mainly the ethnic Danish professors, and this newer crop of international students or international professors were coming in with strong English. But in terms of would they have the equivalent in Danish, that center is for the teaching of English. And some of the professors in the interviews, they had said, well, you know, I'm up for tenure, I'm publishing, how am I going to take time out of my life and go put that much intense effort into learning Danish? But in this new document, it's been written into contracts that they are going to have time to learn Danish. So that seems to be like a wonderful change, like a recognition that if you want these people, and you want them for that reason, that they've got strong English, they'll be able to, you know, they've got cutting edge and all the different places they're coming from around the world, internationalization, that sort of thing. But if you really want them to be Danish, it's not something you can do, you know, 3 hours a night, once a week or something like that. So I haven't got into the specifics of, do they give them 6 months paid, or what do they do? But they are recognizing that, and so for them to develop the Danish skills, they're going to support them. So maybe there will be a new department, like a parallel department to this one that already exists.
It would be interesting just to look at the University of Ottawa and their model for bringing English speakers into French when they do start at nearly, you know, maybe an A2. How do they bring them along? Because there are contractual expectations for becoming bilingual and for getting tenure.
Yep.
There are an awful lot of parallels to Switzerland, to Zurich, where I live. We have exactly the same sort of situation. I don't know very much about it from the inside, but this distinction between, you know, expats in Hong Kong and Singapore, I mean, which is a colonial kind of echo, and the situation, it's not the same as the situation in a cosmopolitan example, about 10 years ago, we had a young woman who came to the place, to Eurocenters, the company I was working with, who was half Iranian, half Swedish, and she'd been living in Zurich for 5 years, couldn't speak a word of German. And she wasn't, we're not talking about an academic milieu, she was in marketing, right? So you have people who are spending their whole professional life there without bothering to learn the local language because you don't need it. You can, you walk into any shop and there will be someone there who speaks English. I mean, with Danes, I mean, when you meet Danish academics, quite frankly, it's happened to me that I've been in a room, did once happen to me, that I was in a room with, okay, they were academics in an English conference, and I didn't realise these people were not English for about 10 minutes. And then it was, I don't know if any of you have seen the film Invasion of the Body Snatchers, it's an old movie, but it was very weird to suddenly discover these people are not who I thought they were. And then I started asking around, and they were all Danes. I just happened to be standing in the middle of a bunch of. So I mean, Danish is so close to it. There are parts of Denmark where the Danish, where the local dialect is very close to English. So it wouldn't surprise me if.
And a lot of them talked
They're
about
very open
that
to English anyway.
they tried, and because the Danes are so proficient in English, and you know, it's kind of like motherese and like caretaker speech and suffering through somebody who's really beginner level, and they would switch, or like French in Quebec, they switch over into English because they just don't have the patience for it. So some who are really trying were having a hard time to find the opportunity to practice their Danish. So.
I think, can I, the people who are online, please just unmute your mic if you want to ask a question. Lupa, do you want to ask a question to Professor Shelley? Okay, go ahead, and then I'll ask mine later.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I was curious about most of the professors stated that they thought that English speaking only would be the best for their students. But one of the research questions was to see if they employed translingual strategies. So even if they overtly expressed that English was best, were there any findings of them using translingual strategies to facilitate any moments of the content of their classes?
This was a little bit of a cultural mismatch between me being in applied linguistics and them being in, you know, zoology or whatever they were in. So I didn't really want to do like a little lesson on, you know, I kind of had to, but so I did ask the question, and one person, he had a really interesting example, and he was talking about German, and it had to do with teaching math. And I was rereading the transcripts before coming, but I couldn't find that example. And there's something in math that he was trying to teach, and whatever they said in German is something that they don't have in English. And German and Danish are really close, so I don't know why he was doing it in German, but he found that when he taught them the notion in German, that they understood that mathematical concept much better. And he generally was really open to, you know, everything pluralism and that sort of thing. So, but that was the most specific example that I had of somebody purposely, except for the person who started, you know, the academic writing. And so it came up in different ways like that, you know, that they would recognize it. That wasn't in her pedagogy per se, but, you know, she ended up offering a specific course with a colleague on the academic writing in sciences. So that was probably the closest I got.
Thank you.
I go back to my question or remark before. I think that you have also in your article, quoting somebody else, it says that this declaration, etc., is because it's not implemented, no? As if I understood correctly, it's a kind of more utopian view, the idea of the different languages.
It's just come out and I haven't, well, I mean, it came out in 2018, but I've just come across it recently and I haven't had a chance to speak to, because I know some of the authors but I just know in speaking to one of the authors, and she had mentioned that there was a, political pressure that the Danish People's Party was not keen on English medium instruction. They would really rather have it go back to Danish. And but I'm just thinking, I mean, part of me is saying this is wonderful. Like this would actually be enacting plurilingual policy and that sort of thing. But if you really want them to be writing research texts and outreach texts, that is the C2 level. And when the one ethnic Danish professor said he didn't think he could write an academic paper in Danish anymore.
Yeah, but that's exactly where I wanted to come. The idea that we have here two tensions. From the political point of view, with different views, one can be in agreement or not in agreement. That's not the point. There is this idea, let's rescue the language, let's protect the language, otherwise it disappears. So there is this top-down policy that doesn't really have any effect other than creating a lot of people that feel angry because they see, or scared because they see something imposed on them. And what is not present there is, and it transpires through what they say, is this idea that the top tier journal being in English, you have to publish there. I think I wouldn't be able to write an article now because I've always been writing in English. I can relate to that. If I had, again now, my last article in Italian is like over 10 years ago, and I think I would struggle for some terminology now. So I think that there is something there because we always have a tendency of seeing this protectionism of the language as a kind of closing yourself into your borders, etc. Kind of very right-oriented view. But in reality, we should switch and see why do the top-tier journal need to be only in English, or why couldn't they say all your publications need to be in different languages? It's a different story than saying what we're doing now. We're going with the market idea. It's a pure capitalist view of research, where the stronger dominates the market, and that's where we are now. Independently of the quality, not completely independently, but very much not aligned with the quality, because there's a lot of there won't be that 20 years down the road if we continue this way, but there is still very good research that doesn't reach the English-speaking countries because it's not translated, because it's not in those top-tier journals, and so more and more there's this tendency of the faculties, for pure career reason, or because they are forced to do that, to publish, because since we have introduced this kind of system which pretends to be objective, how many times have you been cited and all that stuff, people of course go with what pays back more. It's like an investment, and this is a huge problem we're faced with now, and I think that your research shows all the different aspects, and we kind of, what as Kanga says, English as a killer language is no longer a slogan. It's really showing us the effect.
And for a long time, Philipson said he was getting pushback and Danish academics weren't believing it, but I have the feeling this reflects that maybe now they're believing it. Also, when the students are doing their undergraduate and the instruction is in Danish, the textbooks are in English. So, you know, they're developing that academic language in English right from the get-go.
Yeah.
You said something, and Phillips in discussion has also been talking about the danger of Google citations, or what's
Yeah,
that term?
exactly.
Google
Yeah,
citations,
exactly.
and they tend to be in English.
Yeah.
And, you know, I have some publications from the 1990s right up to now, and I think with the pressure that people are under now, I might have thought twice about publishing in those
different
different,
languages.
there wasn't that pushback that, you know, back in the 90s, that it has to be this one and it has to be that one. And there's a very good Danish applied linguistics journal called Sprogforum, which is Forum for Language, and I've published it, Jim Cummins published in it, and so maybe now we would be told not to publish in that. But some of the professors that I was speaking to, they actually said, I don't know of any Danish journals in my area. They just had, not the ethnic Danish ones, but the international, they never read them, or they had never even heard about them. And
Yeah, that's really
Alarming.
Alarming, exactly. Yeah.
I have a different type of question, which is, you know, sort of Sapir-Whorf area, you know, relationship between thought and language. Did this come up at all? You know, the fact, I mean, there's an element of it coming up with it being easy to explain this concept in German than in something else. But I had an argument with or a discussion, an argument with someone recently about this whole business that you can't, if you don't have language diversity, then there are certain perspectives and thoughts and things that are going to get lost because you don't know how to express them in English,
Right.
in the other language, which in this case the lingua franca, which is English, and there is a danger that the lingua franca therefore becomes impoverished over time. And there are criticisms that the type of European Union English speak, sort of bureaucratic English speak that is developing in Europe, that it is, you know, that it's a little bit like that. But the other person said, well, no, that if that might be the case if you were learning this as your mother tongue, you know, but that you're not. You're talking about people who can articulate this thought in their own language, or they could articulate this thought, so they will find a way of articulating it in English. And if you see what I mean, so the argument is that, you know, they will not be able to express it in English because they don't have the words, or maybe you can't express this thought in English anyway, because maybe it's a thought which, as with that example in mathematics, expresses itself better in Danish or German or Finnish or whatever. But since they're not expressing it in those languages, they can't express it. And the opposite argument is that there isn't a connection here between thought and language. They've had the thought, they just have a problem articulating that thought in the particular language, English, and they'll find a way. I wonder whether, did anybody in this whole discussion, did this relationship between language and thought, what they're capable of thinking?
I have a question kind of related to this. Thank you for your research. It's very interesting. And so one of your findings is about that these professors, they feel professors feel that they lost their authority, like kind of they have feeling of loss of authority in their classes. So I'm wondering if any professor mentioned having anxiety or having dissatisfaction with their teaching experience.
The one who started the academic writing in science, she sometimes had to lecture in Danish, and she said she felt very anxious, but at least she had very strong Danish if she was able to lecture in Danish. So she mentioned that, and so she got the closest to talking about common ground, and she said, you know, I can understand, but that didn't come across very often. Yeah, but the ones
how
who
about
expressed the
practice?
anxiety, they were more from the other study.
But how
the
about
literature.
professors that are lacking in English proficiency? Did they have any?
That wasn't in my study. That was in the Henriksen, Holman and Kling book. And that's where I was saying I think they had a different population because they were in that center, the English for Specific Purposes Center, and they were having where the professors could come and they would work one-on-one with them and develop their English for teaching whatever domain it was. And they very definitely did mention feeling a lack of authority and then also there was the quote earlier on by also one of those authors mentioning that students would criticize professors' English, just like some professors would criticize some students' English. So there are definite, they weren't the ones that I had access to, but some definitely feel that way.
Any other question from the people connected online? Or comments? No?
I'm just curious about the students at the university that you did your research at. Is there mandatory English growing up for them in grade school or the equivalent of high school and school?
They have amazing English. They have had it. Now it's being brought in earlier and earlier, but yeah, they have a lot of, even if they're not in a language stream in gymnasium, if they're in a math stream or a science stream, they still have lots of English.
So they're going into their programs with a very solid basis in L2 then. Is there an expectation for them, like would they prefer, you think, to just have their instruction in English only? Or
Well, it's interesting because I have sort of my host family connection that I've kept up there forever, and their daughter was about to start university, and their comment was, I think in 10 years it will all be in English, and they weren't upset about that. I was quite upset about that.
Yeah.
I didn't get to speak to any of the students. From the reports I've had, they're very confident and they have very strong oral English, but there are lots of reports that they have pretty wobbly written English, and so that there would be room for language supports and specific focus on written English in the different disciplines. But I didn't get to speak to students, so.
yeah, it'd be interesting because my background is about my working background is about young adults 18 to 22 in academic English language programs, and they're coming from countries where they weren't raised with the language. They really are invested in learning it, and so it's a different program completely. It's about English, but I'm curious about these students having that basis already and knowing that their future careers will probably depend on them speaking and writing more in English than their L1. Whether that's a push in the classroom even for the language of instruction at that level.
I think the ones who are thinking of going on to the doctorate, definitely, but some of them were in the school of becoming a veterinarian, and they wouldn't necessarily, like they'll be a vet dealing with people, and not so much in that sense. Outside of this, things are very Danish still. There's a very small minority that speaks a different language.
Thanks.
I have a comment.
Yeah, please.
I think they worry about, or the discussion about quality, and the point made that perhaps quality is diluted when everyone is writing in English, is not quite accurate, because you've got to separate the worry about quality from language. I think a principled researcher or writer will give good quality no matter what language they're in. So, and if you were writing in Danish, I think you might be able to find somewhere online a very small journal for Danish readers that had very, very high quality to it. So I think we have to separate the idea that because more people are writing in English, that the quality becomes weaker.
Well, I don't know if you referred to what I said. I don't think I didn't.
Anyways.
Okay. Anyhow, I don't think it's the quality. It's the fact that it's not read beyond a small circle, and so if we reason in terms, in quantitative terms, how many people will read my article, then people may not want to invest in time in publishing in that journal because it won't have any impact or almost any impact. And this creates a vicious circle where those journals don't even receive articles and they are closed down the road, and people don't even try. As to the first part of your remark, Amy, I think that we have to distinguish probably in certain sciences. It's possible because you also have figures that help you, you have graphs that help you, and these are kind of universal concepts that you can put on a graphic representation. But in social sciences, in humanities, I think it's a big challenge that you can translate everything in the way you want it from one language to the other, even if you are beyond the sea. So it's a question, what Brian said, it's not just a question of how fluent and how competent you are in the language, is really that the translation of concepts and ways of seeing things is so different that it's probably not, there is a barrier that you can't really, and if you are always cut off from your own L1 or even your other L2, because it may be in another language, you have to deal with that, but knowing that it's a kind of a handicap that you have, and
even different writing styles.
yeah,
you know.
styles, expressions, idiomatic forms that don't have an equivalent. For example, I don't know, the use or not of classical language as kind of references that I see that in a big way, like in Italian scholarly publication, having sentences in Latin is normal, because everybody knows it's a kind of series of almost chunks that people know in Latin, don't translate, but they are there, and if you try to use them in another language, even in a Roman language, nobody would understand them, or they would find that very odd. So.
But I find as an English writer, I've had in this new plurilingual atmosphere where everyone is writing for English journals, even though their mother tongue is not English, I greatly diluted my I don't progress in my English writing because you don't get the quality of writing from people who are deeply invested in English. It's more like, well, I can write in English, therefore I'll publish in English. But you don't, it's not really, I don't learn from their I don't learn that English style unless I go into a journal that's written in, in very interesting English by some very erudite writer in, in the middle of Oxford or something. Then I say, oh, that's a really nice way of expressing it. So I'm suffering too. Like, it's not only just the fact, that's what I'm saying. I don't think many writers would care about that, but for some reason it matters to me.
Going back to your point, I was the chair of the bilingual education intersection at TESOL, and Mario Lopez, who did his Ph.D. here too, and we had a real movement that we were going to introduce other languages into TESOL, and so we had control over our newsletter for this intersection. And so my graduate students, I was having them do papers in Mandarin and Spanish and etc. And they really begged me to write them in English because there's a big readership. That's one of the smaller intersections, and there were 500 people so technically 500 people were going to see what they wrote. And they said, well, people will just look at it and ignore it because they don't read Mandarin, they can't read Spanish, and they had the opportunity, and so they chose not to. So I think definitely the students who would be going on for hoping to get into a PhD program or hoping to get a faculty position, they would see it that they had to write in English. But there always has been a big emphasis with my Danish professor friends in applied linguistics to keep writing in Danish, and there are several, I think, applied linguistic journals in Danish. So, but I'm not in these other fields, so maybe there aren't journals of biology in Danish, or they're not that level that people are being pushed to publish in.
One more question.
I was just going to say, but it is, I mean, this recent discussion that, the last couple of speakers, but it's not about the actual language at a sentence level so much. It's about the way that articles are constructed, the conventions that govern the way you are allowed to write an article. And there is an Americanization going on. It's much stronger now than it was 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30 years ago. Basically, you cannot write discursive articles the way that you used to. You have to follow this very rigid PowerPoint style template, and that's what's expected. And there are good reasons why it's expected. It's expected for the same reasons that English is expected, because the fact is that there's 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 times as much stuff published now as there was 20 or 20 years ago. Therefore, everybody's got to read a hell of a lot more than they read 20 or 30 years ago. Therefore, you want to know very quickly whether or not you're going to bother to read this article. So you have to have the abstract and the conclusion and these bits that you look at to decide whether or not to read the article. So there are lots of reasons for it, but it's a kind of impoverishment of the whole debate by people following. It's as if everybody was at A2 and needed a model to write a letter, right?
Exactly.
The basic, and I often feel that that why don't people just write what they want to say instead of this kind of very constricted. Because we're talking about people writing in English. This is not the English language. Going back to what Amy was saying, I don't think it's very connected with whether people are a native speaker or a non-native speaker, to use these fashionable terms. I think it's more to do with the style that is reigning in the discipline that you're working in. And if it's I don't know, some physics or something, then it doesn't matter because it's basically being expressed in symbols. But the more that the humanities ape the natural sciences in the way that you present things, the more danger that I think the nuances, these sorts of different ways of seeing things from different perspectives are going to get lost because there's a tendency to follow the same templates, which are all American templates. That we all end up thinking like Americans.
Oh, no, we don't.
Or do we?
No.
But then that's back to this Sapir-Whorf thing. On the other hand, you will always find a way to say what you want, no matter what the language or the template. So it's
Yeah, one of the reasons why there is so much more published is because quantitative counts, whereas before it didn't.
That's changed.
Qualitative counted, not
Yeah.
quantitative. So Sur never published anything about his life, and yet we still mention him. So now he wouldn't have even had tenure. So we have to think about this, because you had the people who wrote one book in their life, and that was the book that remained, whereas now if somebody in the entire career writes one book or
student in his class at Chicago. And thank God he wrote a book.
That's incredible.
And the student was called Ben Ryan.
Yeah.
And the Rash model is now, I mean, nobody would imagine doing any, kind of research to do with sticking things onto levels